was 22 and still living with my parents while finishing university. We lived in a normal 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. During the day, the house was usually empty. My dad worked full-time, and my mom was almost always gone until evening. That day, I had a late class, so I was getting ready slowly. I remember making coffee in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. For some reason, I immediately assumed it was my dad coming back because he forgot something, which is insane in hindsight because I normally always check the doorbell camera first. But that day, my brain just skipped that step. I opened the door, and this guy in a technician vest almost immediately stepped inside the house. He looked around 25, carrying a shoulder bag with a small yellow flashlight keychain hanging from the zipper. It made this faint metallic tapping sound whenever he walked. He spoke quickly and confidently. "Hey, scheduled internet inspection. People in the area reported unstable signal issues." Before I could really respond, he was already inside asking, "Where's the router or the computer?" Everything happened way too fast. It wasn't like he forced his way in, but it also didn't feel like I truly invited him inside either. It felt more like the situation itself pushed him into the house before I could properly think. He sat down at our computer in the living room and started messing with cables. And almost immediately I started getting this awful feeling that something wasn't right. First of all, he was way too nervous, constantly glancing around, tapping his fingers, pulling random cables around even though the computer wasn't even turned on. Second, he barely explained anything. I asked, "So what's wrong with the internet?" He answered, "Just checking the line." But it sounded like he made the answer up on the spot. Then I noticed the logo on his vest, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't the company my family used, not even close. I remember staring at the logo for several seconds while my brain tried to catch up with what was happening. Then I said, "Wait, we don't use this provider." He froze for maybe half a second, then calmly replied, "Some inspections are handled through contractors," and just kept sitting there. That was the moment I became genuinely uncomfortable, because a normal person would have started explaining things better, but he acted like he didn't care whether his story made sense or not. And the longer the silence lasted, the worse the atmosphere in the house became. He kept glancing toward the staircase, toward the windows, toward the front door. Then suddenly he asked, "You home alone today?" I lied immediately. "No, my parents are home." He looked toward the front window and calmly said, "Strange, I didn't see any cars outside." My entire body went cold because it didn't sound like a random comment. It sounded like he had already been watching the house. And right then, a small red plastic zip tie slipped out of the side pocket of his bag. He quickly picked it up and shoved it back inside. After that, the house became dead quiet. He stopped pretending to work on the computer. He just sat there, looking at me. I remember reaching a point where I became afraid to even move, because the atmosphere changed so suddenly that it genuinely felt like something horrible was about to happen. And then I heard the garage door opening. Everything changed instantly. The guy jumped up so fast he slammed his knee into the table, then grabbed his bag and nearly rushed toward the front door. My dad was walking inside at that exact moment. I only remember this brief second where they looked directly at each other in the hallway. But my dad didn't suspect anything. The guy acted completely calm, completely confident. He just said, "Routine network inspection, already finished." Then walked out of the house almost immediately. My dad looked confused because I was standing there looking like I was about to cry. After that, my parents became extremely strict about me staying home alone. And honestly, for a while, I tried convincing myself that I just overreacted. Until about a week later, I was cleaning my room and reached under my bed to grab a charger that had fallen behind some storage boxes. And that's when I saw it. A small red plastic zip tie, exactly like the one that fell from his bag. I remember my hands instantly going numb, because during that visit, he never went upstairs, not once. And that was the first moment I truly thought he had already been inside our house before. That same night, my dad called the company whose logo was on the vest. He gave them the name written on the guy's bag. The operator immediately responded, "We've never had an employee with that name." After that, my dad installed cameras and a security system around the house, and I started obsessively checking notifications on my phone. About a week later, one of the cameras recorded someone late at night, or at least something shaped like someone. The footage was too dark to clearly see a face, just the silhouette of a man standing across the street for a few seconds before walking away. But when my dad turned the audio up, I immediately heard it. A faint metallic tapping sound, like something lightly hitting a zipper while walking. That same yellow flashlight keychain. After that, I almost completely stopped staying home alone. But the worst part happened about a month later. I got sick and stayed home from class. For the first time in weeks, I was alone again. My parents were at work. Around 2 p.m., I got a text from an unknown number. Nice security system. My stomach instantly dropped. I immediately opened the camera app. Nobody was outside. The street was completely empty. I remember sitting there trying to convince myself it was just some random prank. Then another message came through. But you still forget to lock the bathroom window sometimes. When I was 19, I worked morning shifts at a small 24-hour café near the highway. Because of college, I almost always worked the same hours, 6 in the morning until noon. After a while, you naturally start recognizing regular customers. And at first, this guy just seemed like one of them. He looked around 40. The first time he came in, he ordered coffee and a sandwich. Nothing strange. The second time, I asked, "The usual?" He smiled and said, "Oh, you remembered me. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" At the time, it just sounded like a normal joke. But then he started showing up more often, and only during my shifts. At first, I didn't notice it until one of my coworkers said, "That guy's here again. Does he ever come in when you're not working?" After that, I started paying attention, and she was right. I never saw him on any other day. He always sat in one of the back booths where he had a clear view of the register. Sometimes he'd sit there for over an hour with one coffee, just staring at his phone, and sometimes at me. One day, I came into work with my hair in braids because I overslept and didn't have time to do anything else with it. The next day, I wore it down. When he walked up to the counter, the first thing he said was, "No braids today?" And something inside me immediately tightened, because I didn't remember ever talking to him enough for him to notice details like that. After that, my coworkers started trying to take his orders instead of me, but there was a problem. Our receipts printed the cashier's name on them, meaning my name was already on every order. And we realized that way too late, because one day he smiled and said, "You have a pretty name." I never remembered telling him what it was. After that, things started getting worse. He began showing up closer to the end of my shifts. Sometimes he stayed until I was about to leave. Sometimes he came in multiple times during the same morning, like he was checking whether I was there. One day, he came in right before my shift ended and casually asked, "You getting off early today?" That was the moment I genuinely got scared, because it didn't sound like small talk. It sounded like he was trying to learn my schedule. That same day, I asked my mom to come inside the cafe instead of waiting in the parking lot like usual. When I walked out after work, his car was sitting across the street with the engine running. I accidentally glanced in that direction, and he immediately looked up, like he'd been watching the front door the entire time. After that, management finally told him he wasn't welcome there anymore. For a few days, he disappeared. And honestly, I started calming down, until one morning, he walked back into the cafe like nothing had happened. My coworker immediately stepped in to take his order instead of me, but he barely even looked at her. He kept staring at me. Then he smiled and said, "You're wearing the gray hoodie today." I froze, because I was wearing a gray hoodie, but it was underneath my work apron, and I'd only arrived at work maybe 10 minutes earlier. I hadn't even walked into the dining area yet. I tried convincing myself maybe he saw me through the window while I walked in, but then it got worse. He casually asked, "You live pretty far from here, right?" I lied immediately. "No, not really." He slowly nodded, then said, "Strange. I thought you lived near the Ridge Avenue gas station." My stomach dropped, because he was right. That was exactly where we lived, and I had never told him anything about my neighborhood. I remember just standing there staring at him while one thought kept repeating in my head. How the hell does he know that? He must have realized from my expression that he said too much, because he immediately smiled and said, "Maybe I'm mixing you up with someone else," then grabbed his coffee and left. That afternoon, my mom picked me up directly at the entrance instead of waiting in the parking lot. And while we were pulling away, I looked back. His car was still sitting across the street. A few days later, something happened that finally made me quit. It was around 6 in the morning, still dark outside. I had just opened a cafe and went to throw trash into the dumpster behind the building. That's when I noticed a familiar car parked on the other side of the lot. Engine running, lights off. I immediately turned around and started walking back toward the back entrance. And right then, the headlights suddenly turned on. The car slowly started moving toward me. Not fast, slowly. Like whoever was inside already knew I had nowhere else to go. I ran back inside and slammed the door shut. I remember struggling to lock it because my hands were shaking so badly. The car slowly rolled us past the windows, and for just a second, I saw him looking directly at me, smiling. I found the job listing late at night on Reddit. Normally, I never respond to weird posts like that, but that month I was seriously struggling with money. The post was short. Temporary workers needed for overnight mall shifts, $250 per night. No experience required. No company name, no details. Just a Telegram contact. I messaged them mostly as a joke. The reply came almost immediately. They sent me the address of an old shopping mall on the edge of the city and told me to arrive Friday night at 7 p.m. When I pulled into the parking lot, the first thing I noticed was how empty it was. Almost no cars, but the mall lights were still on. I was already thinking about leaving when I got another message. Enter through the main entrance. Please do not leave before midnight. That should have been the moment I turned around and drove home. Instead, I went inside. The mall was quiet. Way too quiet for a Friday night. The food court was open. Several stores still had lights on, but there were barely any people. Maybe 10 in the entire building. A man in a gray blazer met me near the entrance. He didn't introduce himself. He just handed me an envelope full of cash and said, "Your job is to look like a normal customer." At first, I honestly thought it was some kind of weird marketing stunt. Then he continued, "Walk around the mall, go into stores sometimes, sit in the food court, just don't leave before midnight." I asked, "That's it?" He nodded. "That's it." It should have felt like easy money. But the longer I stayed there, the worse the place felt. Some stores looked open, but empty. No employees, no music, just lights on and products sitting on shelves. Sometimes I noticed people walking the exact same paths over and over again. One guy carrying empty shopping bags passed me at least 4 times. On the second floor, I saw a woman sitting beside a small kid at the play area. But over the next 2 hours, I never once saw the kid move. Around 10 p.m., the mall somehow started feeling even emptier. And that's when I noticed something strange. Every customer looked like they were trying to appear noticeable. Someone walked slowly while loudly talking on the phone. Someone else carried shopping bags that looked completely empty. People sat at tables pretending to eat without ever touching their food. It felt staged, like everyone was playing a role. Eventually, I sat down near a guy around my age drinking coffee outside a closed clothing store. I asked, "You hear from the ad too?" He nodded calmly, then said, "You get used to it pretty fast." Something about the way he said it immediately bothered me. I laughed and replied, "What do you mean? I'm definitely not doing this again." But he didn't smile. Instead, he stared into his coffee for a few seconds before quietly saying, "That's what I thought too." After that, he went silent. I tried continuing the conversation. "How long have you worked here?" He didn't answer right away, then finally said, "Almost 3 years." My stomach instantly dropped. I was about to ask why the hell anyone would spend 3 years doing something like this when suddenly the lights flickered overhead and the mall music abruptly stopped. The entire building became dead quiet. Metal security gates started closing over some stores. The lights dimmed slightly, but the people kept walking, slowly, calmly, like nothing had changed. And somehow that made everything feel even worse, because in an almost empty mall, footsteps sound unbelievably loud. The guy beside me quietly said, "After midnight, try not to look at the reflections." I nervously laughed. "Why?" But he didn't answer. He just stood up and walked away. At that point, I decided I was done. I headed straight for the main entrance. But when I reached the doors, they wouldn't open. I could see the parking lot outside through the glass, but the doors stayed locked. I pulled harder. Nothing. Then my phone vibrated. A new telegram message. "Please do not attempt to leave before your shift ends." That was the moment I genuinely panicked. I turned around, and almost everyone in the mall had stopped moving. Some people were staring at their phones, some were standing in front of dark store windows, but a few of them were looking directly at me. I immediately started walking back through the food court, trying not to look at anyone, trying not to look at the dark glass storefronts either. But while passing the electronics store, I accidentally glanced toward the reflection in the window and froze because I could see almost the entire food court reflected perfectly. The tables, the lights, the signs, but none of the people were there. Not a single one, except me. I live alone, at least. I thought I did. This happened last winter, a couple months after I bought a smart speaker for my house. Nothing fancy, just one of those normal voice assistant devices. Music, timers, smart lights, reminders. It sat on the kitchen counter, and I used it every day without really thinking about it. At first, everything was normal. Then little things started happening. Sometimes late at night, the speaker would randomly activate by itself. The indicator light would turn on for a few seconds like it was listening. I ignored it. I figured it was just hearing random sounds from the TV or outside traffic. But one night, I woke up around 2 a.m. because of a strange crackling noise coming from the kitchen. At first I thought it was my phone or maybe the refrigerator. Then I heard it again. A short burst of static, followed by what sounded like whispering. I stayed in bed for a few seconds trying to listen. Then I heard a voice quietly say, "Can you hear me?" It was faint. So faint that I genuinely couldn't tell where it was coming from. But it sounded close enough that my brain immediately connected it to the speaker in the kitchen. I got up and walked out of my bedroom. The house was dark. The only light was the small white indicator glowing on the speaker. I stood there staring at it. Then the whisper came again, this time clearer, and the voice said my full name. Every hair on my body stood up. I immediately unplugged the speaker. The kitchen went silent. The next morning I checked voice history, connected devices, activity logs, nothing. No activation history, no recordings, nothing unusual at all. That actually scared me more, because if there had been logs, at least I could have explained it somehow. The next night, it happened again. Same crackling noise, same quiet voice from the kitchen, and the phrases were strange, not robotic, not like a voice assistant, too human. Things like, "You stayed up late tonight," or "You forgot to lock the door again," like someone was commenting on what I was doing in real time. After that, I stopped using the speaker completely. Eventually, I unplugged it for good, but the sounds kept happening. Sometimes static, quiet breathing, soft whispers, and every single time, my brain automatically assumed the sound was coming from the kitchen speaker. One night, I woke up to a loud creaking sound somewhere in the house, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. Then I heard the whisper again, very quietly, "Don't turn on the light." I jumped out of bed and immediately walked toward the kitchen. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But the second I entered the kitchen, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The speaker was completely unplugged. I had disconnected it earlier that day. No power, no indicator light, nothing. I stood there in total silence, trying to convince myself I was imagining things again, that maybe I was half asleep. That old houses make weird noises at night. And right then I heard breathing, not from the kitchen, right behind me. close enough that I could feel it near my ear. Then someone whispered very softly, "I stood here every single time."